Jan Such Picard from the Iona community wrote a prayer called Honesty, inspired by our gospel reading for today. Let us be in a prayerful place. Listening, watchful God, help us to be honest. Oh, but we are not at all like those who can't be trusted with money, the shifty and the feckless. We're good stewards and faithful servants. Help us to be honest. We are nothing like the fat cats, the greedy few, the haves who care nothing for the have-nots. We're eloquent in the language of sharing. Help us to be honest. Oh, but we are not like those who like to look good and deceive even themselves, who talk the talk, but help us to be honest. That sometimes our getting it right gets in your way. Help us to be honest about our failings, how far we still have to go. Help us to pray without words, with tears instead. And help us honestly to love justice, to seek mercy, and to walk humbly in your way. Amen. But oh, how difficult it is for you and for me to be honest. Honest with one another, with ourselves, and with our God. I spent 4 out of 5 days this week gathered with clergy. Maybe too much even for clergy. I was at an all-day conference meeting and then 3 days on retreat. At times there were very real moments, honesty, time of sharing and caring with and for one another. When we opened ourselves up and revealed our faults and our shortcomings. When we were open and welcomed the advice and comfort and healing of our peers. And then there were times when we were involved in ego-driven moments of lifting up and posturing over one another. When we revealed to our peers our accomplishments and our strengths. When we were judging and pointing out the flaws and the weaknesses of others, while patting ourselves on the back for all that we have done and for all that we deserve. Reflecting on this week, I heard the words of Jesus, seemingly telling his story directly to me and to some of the others who were pleased with ourselves, placing our performance over our peers, looking down our noses at those less fortunate or not as successful. Jesus said, 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was a rector, and one was an IRS agent. The rector up front posed and praised like this, "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like other people, liars, crooks, adulterers, presidential candidates. Or heaven forbid, like that IRS agent. I fast twice a week and I tithe my income." Meanwhile, the IRS agent slumped in the shadows, way in the back, his face in his hands, not daring to look up. He said, "God, give mercy. Forgive me, a sinner." Jesus goes on. This IRS agent and not the other will go home and be made right with God. If you walk around with your nose up in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you are content to simply be yourself, you'll become so much more than yourself. My seminary parables professor loved to quote Emily Dickinson. "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." When we look at stories Jesus tells us from a slightly different perspective, light shines in and through them and goes out into different directions that we do not expect. This is really helpful for me with parables that echo my own behavior. This is really helpful because Jesus this morning doesn't tell us this story to be moralistic about how not to be persistent in the wrong things like those the parable offers. On the one hand, persistence in habitual arrogance, or on the other hand, persistence in perpetual browbeating. Jesus wants so much more from us, but we can't help being ourselves. We can't help hearing or reading a parable story and trying to relate to those characters. And if you're like me, you liked and tend to identify with the more positive characters in any story. But in this story, the rector would not be my first choice. When I try and immerse myself in that character, it gets too real. You see, I would need to admit that I'm proud of my values and how I live my life. It would mean admitting that my credentials, education, good intentions, and position make me somehow better than other people, make me more deserving of God's attention and salvation. It might just hit a little too close to home. I think I'd rather be an IRS agent. Not, of course, because of what he does. We know that he is hated by the community. He's probably someone that has taken advantage of his profession and position. But I'd rather be him because of his humility. And God liked his prayer better. It reminds us all of those mom loves me more, I'm smarter, prettier, better, richer, brighter than you moments. Those times when our selfish, sinful, real selves scream and shout, or that stuff just slips out when we think it. And when we think we're doing the right thing. When we do our thing instead of God's thing. But humility alone is not the good news for this day. As Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir famously said, "Don't be humble. You're not that great." The reality of this story seems to me that the Pharisee is an anomaly. You see, Pharisees were seen like Episcopalians, good people out in society. They were the progressives of the day. And the tax collector, also seen as an anomaly. They were the bad guys. They were looked down upon. But both are without health this day in this story. And sin connects them both. In the beautiful language of the Book of Common Prayer, the supplication is used typically at the end of morning or evening prayer, and often it's used individually as a devotion during times of crisis, war, disaster, national anxiety, following debates maybe. We pray in the supplication for God to mercifully look upon our infirmities, to bring us health and to turn from us all of those evils that we most justly have deserved, and to grant in the midst of our troubles that we may put our whole trust and confidence in God's mercy, that we may serve God humbly in holiness and pureness of living. Today, Jesus' story sweeps away conventional expectations. Jesus surprises the disciples and you and me when he says it's not the Pharisee but the tax collector that morally suspect second-class citizen who goes home justified, made right with God. It's a bold reminder for those of us who see ourselves as church insiders. Or maybe you sitting here this morning thinking about how much better you are than the folks who are getting the better tables for breakfast or lunch. How much better you are than the person lying in bed under warm covers this morning, sitting with their favorite caffeine product, reading their favorite Sunday newspaper, spread out on the bed. It's easy for us to see ourselves over and better than others. But our reality is that we are sinners who beg for God's mercy, utterly dependent on God's forgiveness and love, and thankfully not merely on ourselves. We're dependent on God for that mercy for ourselves and for all of God's creation. The good news today is that Jesus knows us and loves us, forgives us and walks with us, even when we are being ourselves, both Pharisee and tax collector, all at the same time. You heard me say last week, and I'll repeat it again today, that we are both saints with a past and sinners with a future, who take comfort in the words of the prophet Jeremiah. You, O Lord, are in the midst of us, and we are called by your name. Beloveds, God is in our midst, working in your life because of who and whose you are, in spite of how bold or humble you may be, in spite of what you've done or left undone. You are made in the image of and called by our God, and God promises to never stop loving and forgiving and being with you, always.